Welcome to the Go Big Redcast with Dave, Honky, Boomer, and Redcast Rob.
Welcome to the Go Big Redcast. I'm your host, Honky, and I'm with Redcast Rob.
Hey, Redcasters. How's everybody doing out there? I just want to say welcome to our second edition of the Go Big Lunchcast, and we have a very special guest today, Brandon Vogel of Hail Varsity fame.
Yeah, he's the managing editor of Hail Varsity. He's covered Nebraska athletics for the magazine and web since 2012. His sports writing has also been featured in Fox Sports, The Guardian, and CBS Sports. Welcome to the Redcast, Brandon.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Before we get a little deeper into the Husker talk that we will no doubt do, Rob, both Hail Varsity and Redcast, we are both part of the Herd at Media Network, and Redcasters can now get their hands on some of the great Hail Varsity content out there using a special promo code, correct?
That is right. All you need to do is enter Redcast promo code in the checkout when you are subscribing to Hail Varsity, and you will receive a $10 discount on your first year of subscribing. And then you got to go and click on the merchandise and buy some Redcast merchandise or some Hail Varsity merchandise so you can support the local media and us just at-home podcasters as much as possible. And
yeah, I've got my Herd at shirt on, my official one here, so I'm towing the company line right now.
I'm wearing a Grateful Dead shirt because, well, I live in Colorado.
Yeah,
so.
You can do that.
That'll score you points with Mike Babcock, Hail Varsity Husker historian extraordinaire, and our editor. Huge Grateful Dead fan.
Yeah, I've been a big fan since probably the late 80s, early 90s when I was in high school growing up in the Bay Area. I had some friends whose parents worked for Grateful Dead Productions, so it made going to shows really easy. So I miss Jerry, but John Mayer's fantastic. What can I say?
Well, Rob he lives in Greeley, Colorado, and Brandon, you're out in that area too. In fact, we have Nebraska is the largest small town in the country, and so we have a shared connection. A good college friend of mine, Amy, she's your cousin from Hemmingford, and it's been very clear it's Ford, not Ferd. And she would always, tell me about, friends would say, "Hey, I'm going out to Western Nebraska. We're going out to Kearney," and would just drive her nuts because that's, But speaking of that, coming from the Panhandle, being a Western Nebraska guy and growing up out there. Maybe a good start here is, what is it like to be a Husker fan growing up 6 hours away from Lincoln? And I think of like high school recruits right now, Nebraska recruiting in state, Scottsbluff, everywhere to Omaha and everything in between. What's it like to be a kid growing up out there? And what does that mean to be a Nebraska fan, coming from that part of the state?
Yeah, it's certainly different. I went to one Nebraska game as a kid, essentially. My first game. So I was in high school. Freshman year was 94, senior year was 97, 98. So as good as it gets in terms of Nebraska's on-field performance. But my parents, we went to one Nebraska game. It was 1987, Oklahoma, Nebraska. So not one that went the Huskers' way, but a pretty historical and meaningful game for your first one. But it's 6 hours away. And, because I grew up out there, like 6 hours now doesn't seem that far, but you're trekking down there with 3 kids or whatever it is, you gotta find a place to stay, all of that. So get up early Saturday morning and pop down to Memorial Stadium wasn't an option. So I went to Nebraska football camp when I was in high school, but I went to football camps at like Colorado State and Wyoming much more, because that was a lot closer for me. Like when we went, to a city, it was more often Fort Collins or Denver than it ever was Lincoln or Omaha. So you get that far out there, basically 45 minutes from South Dakota or 45 minutes from Wyoming. It felt a lot different than being in the eastern half of the state.
Where are you at, Brandon? Are you here in Colorado?
No. I grew up in Hemmingford. This is a weird story, but I actually live in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and have for a while. So I work remotely 90% of the time. During football season, I try to get back to Lincoln or Omaha pretty often. And it's actually not too bad for road football game coverage, because Chattanooga is as close to half the Big Ten as Lincoln ends up being. So road games are kind of my jam at the moment.
Well, we
Yeah.
like to do a little segment here. We call it You Tweeted It, our Tweets of the Week. And we have a couple of viewers here. And I think this will tie nicely into maybe the first discussion we have. You had one from February 11th here, and using a fresh set of 2022 power ratings and a little math, let's project some Husker point spreads and season win totals. And really good article that you had there. I have it in front of me right now. But I guess as we start to look at this is based off the SP Plus ratings and you see it all over the place, but also there's things like Nebraska, checking in at 11.7, meaning NU is projected to be 11.7 points better than the average college football team. And you address this in the article, but I think it's best for you to kind of go over this too. It's like, how can that 3-9 team, that didn't win more than 25% of the games, how can it be 11.7 points better than the average team?
Yeah, that's kind of the cold calculating piece of these power ratings, and there's a lot of them out there. I like ones like SP Plus, FPI is this way. I mean, Sagarin's this way. They're meant to you're meant to be able to do some math with those numbers, which is take the ratings, subtract one from the other, and come up with basically a projected point spread. And once you have a projected point spread, you can go and figure out win probabilities based on historical modeling. All boring stuff. But for the simple answer is SP Plus, and SP Plus is one that tends to value, I think, what Nebraska does well, particularly during the Frost era, more than some others. And I can talk about that if you guys want to or not, if you want to go that deep into it. But it doesn't view them as a 3-win team. It looks at their, how often they stayed on schedule. That's a really key component of S&P Plus or SP Plus. Things like that, explosive play rate, which is good for the offense. It's good for the defense too in terms of limiting those in 2021. And at the end of the day, you had a team that outscored their opponents on the year and won 3 games. And it just that almost never happens. And there's a litany of kind of ways you could look at that for Nebraska, but that's essentially it. It looks at Nebraska as somewhere probably closer to a 6 or 7 win team, even though they only won 3 actual games. And of course, that's all that matters at the end of the day. But in terms of off-season projections, that's where they're going to start out.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this at nauseum now on the Redcast over the last couple of months, is the 9 single-digit losses, the 8 one-score losses, putting up 239 points in the Big Ten and giving up 239 points, but finishing 1-8 during that time. To your point, we didn't win more than 25% of our games, yet we had a positive point differential. We're one of 4 teams in the college poll era since the 30s to do that. How historic was last season? And we brought up this graph, and this was a graph from CFB numbers and CFB data, and we've all seen it on social media by this point. Now, all the dots that we were just as likely to go 11-1 as we were 4-8 last year, and we ended up 3-9. How historic, Brandon, was last season when you really think, when you throw all those numbers together and the analytics, and now you're trying to project the next season too, but how historic was what we just went through, in 2021?
Pretty historic. And, I saw that graph and that write-up. It was really excellent. And that probably explains it. When you look at 3-9 and the likelihood piece of it was really key to me, where you could say that they were just as likely to win, 10 or 11 games. And there was another chart in that write-up that kind of plotted them all on a vertical axis. And it's like, you got a vast, vast middle where all these teams just kind of fall naturally. And then here's Nebraska all the way at the bottom. So I like to look at a thing called Pythagorean win theorem. And it's just a simple formula created by Bill James for baseball. But it just looks at that. It says, with this scoring differential, whether it's positive or negative, what percentage of your games should you win? Nebraska ended up, so that one modeled Nebraska at 7.5 wins. And I have this going back to 2007. It's just something I look at every offseason for every college football team because it's really simple to do. And they're basically 4.5, pretty close to 4.5 wins below that projection. The next closest is 3.9. And that's over 1,600 individual college football seasons that I have just sitting in a spreadsheet. Georgia Tech, I think, was that team in 2016, somewhere around that range. They won 3 games, modeled closer to a 7-win team, and then won, I think, 9 games the next year. Not saying that's what's going to happen with Nebraska, but you get to the top end of that kind of view of things, or the bottom end, teams that had a much higher win. I mean, Michigan State is a team in this category going into 2022, a team that won more than you would expect based on its point differential. And things do tend to even out a little bit, though it's never a guarantee that things are going to happen, of course, just for that reason.
Well, Brendan, you're really pulling at my heartstrings there because I'm a big Oakland A's fan. So when you start talking Bill James, you know, and you know, you might as well just use the term that they coined with Moneyball. But you know, that's where I like hearing those numbers because while the A's may not be winning World Series, they're consistently in the playoffs. They're consistently winning games based off of the model of all of that. So it's truly I would say a system that I believe in really well. But I'm also convinced looking at the schedule, there's no reason why the Huskers can't go 15-0 this year and win a national championship. So, you know, it's one of those funny things because last year, I think that was probably my biggest frustration. It wasn't the losses. It was how they were losing them and the fact that they were just so close. And it's like, as a realistic person trying to step outside of it, not being a native Nebraskan, right? I'm looking at this from a perspective that maybe the other Redcasters don't, where I'm thinking God, they're so close. I just want to stay positive. And then, you know, they come in and, you know, they rip your heart out, whether it's, you know, a play that should have been called, turned into called dead, turned into a fumble, turning the game around with a loss to Michigan, right? Or something along those lines where, you know, all you want to do is stay positive and know that they were right there. But it's it's harder to prove wins and losses in your mind, you know, of what could have happened as opposed to what really did happen, if that makes sense. And, you know, I understand where you're coming from on this, you know, with these analytics. While I don't understand all the math and stuff like that, I'm like that weird GIF where they're going. But you know, but I'm curious, how do you without the numbers, all that, just from would it be your objective point of view, what do you think realistically they should be doing for 2022-23 season?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. They have pretty clearly, in my mind, made improvements overall to the team as a whole each year. And, you know, 2019 is kind of the weird one in there. And then 2020 is just weird in general because it's kind of hard to know what to take in that year with any team. But in my view, I think Nebraska has gotten incrementally better. The question for me is I view them as a team that's been better than their actual win-loss record all 4 years. But that becomes a cumulative thing, for me at least, of, okay, that's great. It's especially coming out of a year one, you're like, oh, you know, they didn't get to bowl eligibility, but they are actually better than this 4-8 record. Great things ahead. You know, it's just as those things pile up, at what point do you have to stop? And, you know, this is a question everybody has to kind of figure out for themselves. Stop and say, well, is there something kind of endemic here that is holding them back from getting everything they've earned out of these games? Nebraska over the past 4 years is a team that has made gains. I think they're building the right way for the most part, but why hasn't it been reflected in the record yet? And that becomes really tough. And that's something that you are best not even attempting to quantify. You know, I kind of look at it as you have to look at kind of the culture and the approach. And these are things we know comparatively little about. We get a lot of access to Nebraska football, but we don't see the majority of practices. What we do see of practices are, you know, pretty much staged and meant to be as least illustrative as possible, which I get it. All coaches are paranoid and, you know, it doesn't help them at all. So I understand that part of it, but you just have to wonder, consistently successful programs, I think, are built on kind of doing things for the sake of doing them. And as the thing that gives me pause with Nebraska right now is the pressure to win is here. It's really here now, going into 2022. So how do you kind of flip that? You know, you can't make winning itself the goal. You kind of have to make being excellent at executing all of these tiny little things the goal, and the win should come with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you think about it, we call them the tiny things, or whether they're big or small, at the end of the day, the things that have kind of killed us in the past. And so I counted up last year, we had, I believe it's 46 points that were scored to us in unconventional ways not against our defense. So that defense that performed so well in the second half against Michigan State and all that, we still lose games. Well, why? Because we give up punt returns for touchdowns and kickoff returns, and punts get blocked for touchdowns, and a fumble return, an interception return, and catching punts in an end zone, throwing it out of the end zone, and getting an extra point blocked and return for 2 points. It adds up, and you end up with 9 single-digit losses with 8 one-score losses, and that's how you do it, right? That's how all those data points that say you should go 8-4, 9-3, you end up going 3-9. That stuff has to end. And I guess the question that we have here is, you can go back to me, a dark period was October of last year, where we didn't know what was going to happen. We knew things weren't going well. We're 3-6, 3-7, but are we blowing this up? I mean, there's plenty of people out there, and they'll still tell you they should blow it up, right? That they, there's plenty of people that still have that mentality. My personal mentality was, we've done enough of that. We're the second biggest dead money school in the country since 2010. We didn't need to add to it, but that didn't mean that changes didn't need to be happening. And we've had changes now. We got rid of 4 coaches. The special teams there, we have Bill Bush, who was a very successful coordinator here from 05 to 07 in that exact same role. Mickey Joseph, you see those changes that have been made. Do you feel like is there enough difference between a year ago, what we have now? Are you starting to see it now that spring ball started? We're a week into it. Is there enough changes that give you confidence that you think that we can get over that proverbial hump?
Yeah, I don't know if I can say I've seen it yet. It's still really early. I would say the Mark Whipple hire struck me as an interesting one, because it wasn't the conventional path that I think, it wasn't a path that was going to kind of win you the most likes when you tweeted out the news. Like, Mark Whipple's a football lifer, go before 2021, unless you were closely following Pitt football. I'm guessing a lot of people didn't even know he was the offensive coordinator there. And then they had a great year, and and Whipple has an impressive career. You talk about winning a national title at UMass. They did that as an 11 seed in that. I would love to talk to him about college football playoff expansion, because he's a guy that's been there and won it as one of those double-digit seeds. But that one was one that struck me. It was like, okay, maybe there's this isn't just change for the sake of change, because you get somebody who's coached that much football and been in the NFL and been everywhere in the ACC. He's not going to be afraid to challenge your current ideas. He's got the track record that says, hey, you should probably listen to me. That's why you hired me in the first place. But that experience also, I think, helps him realize what has been good about Nebraska. And a lot about Nebraska's offense in particular, I think, has been good. And defense definitely has been. I mean, defense, you can show a pretty solid rise from year 1 to year 4. So the Whipple piece of it really encouraged me. I really liked listening to Mickey Joseph last week during their opening availability. That was kind of everything you heard about Mickey and his ability to build connections with recruits and players, current players, was kind of there for me. So, and we'll see with the other 2 offensive hires. The special teams hire, I think, is encouraging. Nebraska has been so below average there that I'm not somebody who naturally thought just a special teams coordinator fixes this, and I don't know if it does, but it was pretty clear to me they needed somebody devoted to that as their primary objective. So you add those things up, and Nebraska as a team that, again, comes out of last year. If this was, State University, just some generic team with that profile, it's a team I would expect to be better in 2022. I think the changes on the coaching staff in particular have only made me feel like that's a little bit more the case.
So some of the things that we've talked about on the Redcast before, that I think you're kind of making a case for as well, is that these hires weren't made as quick fixes either, right? Like, a lot of these hires that they're making kind of make it seem evident that they're not just looking at win now, right? They're looking at, continuous winning. Guys like Whipple and Joseph aren't just going to show up on the Nebraska campus because they think like, oh, this is where I'm going to live my life for one single year, right? I mean, they're adapting to the Nebraska culture, on a daily basis. You can see that as evidenced by Joseph's wife on Twitter, right, where she's talking about stuff and getting really involved. But my point is that, and I'm wondering how much of like Whipple taking the job and I've heard so many times that Frost is the smartest guy in the room, right? He is, and the smartest guy in the room will always surround himself with people that are smarter than him, right? That's just a basic philosophy in business and life and anything you do. And I'm wondering too is how many of this was like, they brought in guys like Casey Thompson at quarterback, right? And then they got Purdy. And those are two guys that were, when they're talking transfer portal quarterbacks, those were the guys, right? And we got both of them. And so when I look at it, it doesn't seem like they're just trying to plan everything for today. They're planning stuff for like, to put it into regular person terms, we're planning for 6 months to a year down the road, right? Like we're saving up for that vacation to the national championship is kind of like the way that I see that they're building it. And that's not my Kool-Aid talk, but that's kind of what it looks like they're trying to build. And so I'm curious, like how much of that, do you hear any of those kind of rumbles in there? Because we're calling this Frost 2.0, right? This is season 1. And, what type of rumblings, things like that do you hear like in the background about this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think there's a general kind of the general feeling right now around Nebraska is that, okay, when you made those changes in November, November, you come out and you say, well, this is going to allow me to take more of a CEO role. You keep hearing CEO. And it's like, that's great. That's kind of the thing you say when you decide to make a move like that. But the rumblings I hear is that that's happening. There's Mark Whipple has taken control of kind of that offense piece of it. Not that, he and Scott aren't trying to meld their two systems together, but he's just a guy who's like, I got this. Like, let me help you. So that piece of it's been good, and it's allowed Frost to kind of be out and be at places that he hasn't been typically in practice. So all of that part of it is, I think, as good as you would hope that could go so far at this early stage based on things that I'm hearing. There was when we were still, everyone's talking about, well, is Nebraska going to have to make a coaching change? Are they going to have to make changes at the assistant level? I looked at that and I was like, man, are you going to be able to command kind of the interest those jobs should command when objectively you kind of have to look at this and say, well, they got to win now. Like, Mickey Joseph kind of being that first hire out of the gate indicated to me that, okay, they must be doing pretty well with their pitch to this and what they're hearing, not just from Frost, but probably from the athletic director down of there's some time here. Because Mickey Joseph, LSU had a coaching change. He probably could have gone a lot of places. He's got like 78 players in the NFL, it seems. And, his stock is high. And he's demonstrated a recruiter. So he would have had a lot of options. And to choose a place that, would he have chosen Nebraska, even though it's his alma mater, if he thought this is like a 1 year or else deal? And I don't know if he would. So.
Yeah, I think that is something that, there's this narrative, and I'll just call it a social media narrative for the time being, because that's where I see it. But it's this narrative that this is really a one and done, make or break kind of season for Frost. And there's a part of me that's like, well, that's the case anyways, when you're making $4 million a year, right? I think that he had to put a plan together to stay. I don't think Trev was just going to keep him for the heck of it. It was, you have to have a plan, right? And that plan, and Trev's there to support him, but Trev's doubled down on football. It's not just here's the staff that you can hire. Then they go out and they get Vinny Gupta, I believe, the recruiting guy. They're giving additional resources in spots. This is about long-term success. Yeah, you need to win next year, but they should have won last year, right? We just went over those kind of stats, and that. So basically, essentially, when I'm looking at this, they're building something for the long term here. And you bring in Mickey. And I love a story where Mickey and Bill Bush were in the locker room after winning the national championship at LSU. And everyone's smoking cigars and everything. But they talked about how cool this would be to do this in Lincoln. And that is something that they even talked about at that point. And to your point there, Brandon, I don't think you don't just come here if you feel like this is a ship that's sinking. And I don't see any reason for people to think that. I don't see any reason there's nothing that Trev has ever done in the position that he's in. I think he's doing a great job. He's never done anything to make me think, wow, we're trying to somehow figure out a way that Frost is out here in a year. I think he's giving him everything to succeed. And I think that we have a great plan in place, and the staff that they hired is meets that plan. I love it. I love what we're doing. I'll show this stat here, the in-state recruiting that's going on. And this is something with Mickey Joseph being here in place too. Again, I mentioned it from west to east of the state, from Scottsbluff to Omaha, a kid from Pierce, we're getting back into Lincoln. We're definitely hitting Omaha, an area that we didn't hit as hard last year or get as many guys. And I'd love to talk with Greg Smith about some of this stuff too, I'm sure. But, we're already hitting into 2024, 2025, getting kids. That's the long-term play. And that's not going to win next season for you. But the way you win next season is on special teams, you stop kicking the ball and getting it blocked, and you stop giving up kickoff returns and punt returns. And hopefully that's what Bill Bush is here for,
Yeah, and he's got a proven track record, and he has familiarity with the place. The anecdote you shared from the LSU locker room is a great one. I'm not somebody who kind of starts out with these coaches of thinking, well, you got to find somebody who's been here and understands the culture. Like, I think that's a bonus if you can get it. But Nebraska got it, and I think it's coming into play here with the dynamic between Alberts and Frost, because I agree with you. I don't get the sense that the decision that was made, to whatever degree there was a decision to be made about the head coaching position towards the end of last year. Like, I think Trev felt perfectly comfortable with what he did, and same a little bit with basketball here, which has had an interesting immediate result. So that in-state recruiting piece of it remains big. Nebraska, it gets talked about probably more than it should, but may still be undervalued in just, everyone says it's just too hard to recruit to Nebraska, or it's hard.
Yeah.
It depends on whether you're talking to somebody who is potentially a Nebraska fan and local, or somebody national who's just like, oh yeah, you can't recruit to Nebraska. I mean, you can, but the attrition piece becomes a bit bigger, I think, there, because you do have to recruit so nationally. And the level of player coming out of the state of Nebraska, over the past 6, 7, 8 years is increased dramatically, in my opinion. So Nebraska, if they can keep those guys, they add so many more benefits than an equivalent player who's from Mississippi or Tennessee.
Yeah, I've always said with Nebraska, analytics sometimes are tough with a school in a state like Nebraska, where you're the winningest program by far over a 45-year period, yet you are from the least populated P5 state during that time period, right? It doesn't equate. It doesn't make sense. We have talent in this state, and yet we've had coaching staffs in the past that didn't always value that talent, didn't go after it as much. And then sometimes you end up finding that talent going to opposing teams, and that's never a good thing either. It's one of the reasons we love to continue to hit on these in-state recruits, that it's not that you're going to get every in-state recruit. You're going to lose a Gale Sayers. You're going to lose. There's guys that have left over the period of time. I don't want to rewrite history that way, but you go after them just every bit as hard. And that kid that's in Scottsbluff, who's 6'5" and 260, he can be just as good as the kid down in Louisiana who's 6'5" and 260. And it doesn't mean you don't go after both. It just means that you don't necessarily treat one different. I really appreciate what I'm seeing out of this staff so far in that regard. You'd mentioned, I want to go back to the tweet here, and you'd mentioned since Hoiberg and Trev had their discussion here, look at the wins going up. And I don't want to correlate things so much one to the next, but Trev just seems, as an AD, he just seems to have brought a calm over the program. As a fan right now, I can sit here and say I feel really comfortable that we're not going to have just major blunders and disasters, that in the middle of March, there's not going to be some tweet coming out saying that we don't want to play Oklahoma, and it becomes a 5-hour, for lack of a better word, I wish I had something better, but shit show. And we don't need that as a fan base.
Language.
I know. But so, let's talk Trev for a second here. Maybe it is the Trev effect. I think that, Rob, you've mentioned that a number of times. I feel so confident with his leadership here, but what have you seen out of him personally in your role when you've had chances to talk with him? What do you see out of Trev that moving forward Husker fans can expect, I guess, with the programs?
The biggest thing has been, and this, was kind of the thing that struck me most from his initial press conference after he was hired, just the sense of calm, the sense of we're going to put a plan in place. And there's a lot that at that point, he didn't even know yet, some of the problems he was probably going to encounter, everything that plan needed to include. But I think he's got a pretty good grasp on it now. And the biggest thing has just been, for me, he's displayed a sense of patience, which is hard to have as, you're kind of run of the mill or stereotypical athletic director. We hear all the time, new guys come in, the football coach, he's not my guy, and they're not doing that well, so I'm going to make a change. That's obviously different with Alberts and Frost as both alums. But you mentioned it earlier, just having that, Nebraska has had a ton of change. And when you get into that cycle, and Nebraska's been there since Solich was fired. It's we decide we need to make a change. Next guy comes in. We think that's the one that's going to work. It doesn't work. So 4 years later, you're out again. And to get out, Nebraska's tried that. And a lot of schools have tried that. And it feels really random to me. It's really kind of a crapshoot. Georgia fired Mark Richt, who's, knocking on the door of conference titles seemingly every year, went to a Saban protege, and it worked out. But that's one of the few that I can think of off the top of my head of that was when I watched the national championship game. I was like, wow, it was Georgia did it. It worked exactly like you always hope it would. So at this point for me with Alberts, whether it be basketball or football, I'm kind of why not try let's wait. Let's not just jump, and let's slow down and see if we can together come up with a way to do this. And I think that's the big thing too with Alberts is where needed, he can have a very active role, and he has been very active in both men's basketball and football so far.
Yeah, and that stability. I love that stability that he brings there, because from the 45 years that I mentioned when Nebraska by far led the country in wins, basically 62 to 2003, or those 42, 43 seasons, whatever it ended up being, we had three coaches. Even a school like Iowa, and we don't like to say their name over here, but they've had two head coaches since 1979, and that leads to a level of stability that can come over that time period too. And that's something that the firing every 3, 4, 5 seasons, that tends to not, you're not going to, Alabama's not doing that at the head coaching spot, and the successful schools are not doing that time and time again. You try to build some stability there, and that's certainly what we're seeing. Rob, did you have something?
Well, yeah. And I mean, I was even going to point out too, and people tend to forget this, but from 2008 all the way up until, gosh, I would even say Riley's second year, dare I say, when they were 9-4. I mean, the Huskers had the fourth most wins in NCAA football. It just always seemed like they couldn't get right over that hump, And so, when we brought Frost in, it felt like they were just right there, right? That's what should have happened. And with everything that's gone on the last few years, the last 4 years kind of seem like a whirlwind, really, right? So everything is just kind of and even last year kind of felt like it should have been that season, right? And so it just makes me wonder, why not this year, right? Why not this year? Because this is what was this year to me, if it happens, is what should have realistically maybe happened 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before this whole pandemic hit and everything else, and the weird scheduling and, games being canceled and, and I have a point here with Trev too, because Trev kind of feels like the kind of guy that he would just, you run into him, you're talking to him out at dinner or something, you run into him, you don't know him, and you're just like, hey, I would love to have this guy over for my wife's best dish, right? To sit down, and then only to find out that, oh my God, this is my new boss. And this is the type of person you work with. Because I work in the newspaper industry, right? And we got bought 2.5 years ago. Actually, 2 years ago this week, we got bought out by a much larger company. And I was getting ready to leave. I was just done. I was working every day. I was putting it in. I was just done. We got bought by this new company. I have the same job. but I have new bosses and I have a new support team around me. And all of a sudden, like now I'm having like my best years ever. Right. And I kind of equate it to that. And I almost feel like, that's the most real life situation you could put in there. And so, it's nice to hear that you're seeing that kind of from the inside too, that like, that's sort of the attitude that a lot of people have. And and it's nice to kind of put that out there into the universe, especially for those Husker fans who are going to come back and listen to this show,
Yeah. I mean, the sense of unity, I really think Trev came in and made this kind of priority number one of kind of building almost a team culture within the athletic department itself. And I don't know when or how Nebraska lost that a little bit, but it certainly seems like Trev thought that they had, and that's kind of the first thing. And to go to these two coaching decisions that he had to potentially make this year, like if I were somebody in his position, it would be hard for me to say, well, that's not good enough, that's not working over there, I need to like blow that whole thing up, when that in your view, kind of the culture you're trying to build maybe wasn't as strong as it needed to be. So I think, it kind of puts everybody on the same timeline, talking football, basketball, athletic department as a whole, where, hey, we're kind of all in this together. We're going to be hyper focused on what we need to do to build consistent success. So it's kind of a unique time at Nebraska in that regard.
Well, let's finish up with basketball, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I mean, the last week has been kind of crazy here. I think it's completely unexpected. I can speak for myself, certainly in that, what happened about 10 days ago, the announcement came out that Trev was going to retain Fred, and that didn't shock me. In fact, really, the discussions I was having with people I talk with, I'm like, we know how Trev handled the Scott Frost situation. I kind of envisioned something similar. He's going to give him every opportunity to succeed. You have to come to me with a plan. He's not going to try to add 18 million to the dead money pool already that we have out there. But what can we do to get better? Right. Well, now that we've seen the last week, and I'm going to just show the Big Ten turning right now, we've moved up to 13th. Ahead of Minnesota in the final standings. We'll play Northwestern to start off on Wednesday night. And, I'm not trying to predict a 5-day run that's going to send us into the NCAA tournament, but Brandon, just seeing what you've seen here over the last week, first off, how surprised are you by it? And how far can this team go?
Quite surprised. And, at the time that Trev made the announcement, he did. I wasn't surprised either, but things had gotten pretty bleak. Like, back in January, you're kind of like looking ahead at the schedule and you're like, how many conference wins are even here potentially for this Nebraska basketball team? And it just kind of kept nosediving. And for me, it's been an example of, I think their play over these 3 games that they've won shows the weight of what this is. And, it indicates to me that they're still very much a program that's kind of in a young state, because when you are trying to build, and they've had a ton of roster turnover, which hasn't helped in terms of building consistency. You sort of need a little bit to go right early on. I think it helps you. It helps expedite that process. And they didn't have it. And for whatever reason, just knowing that Hoiberg's going to be back, a lot of guys are going to have decisions to make of what that means for them past this season. But it just felt like a little bit of a sigh of relief for everyone. And they've come out, and that's how they look like they've played. Nebraska, prior to what unfolded Sunday evening, it looked like they're going to be matched up with Penn State. I actually like the matchup with Northwestern a little bit better, even though Northwestern really took it to Nebraska that first time. So I think they got a great shot in that first one. And you go there, and then you've got Iowa after that, which was, this was a lot of Big Ten games, but their 2 against the Hawkeyes was one where they were pretty good for about 30 minutes. And then Iowa pulled away over the last 10 or so. So you take your chances with that matchup too. So if they could get one win in this Big Ten tournament, it would send the program into the offseason with just a little bit of momentum. You get 2, and I think you're really rolling. But beating Wisconsin on the road is obviously no joke. And it wasn't Wisconsin. Wisconsin had something to play for, obviously, an outright Big Ten title that Nebraska prevented them from getting. So the talent level has always been there for Nebraska. It's just been, for whatever reason, it has coalesced. And winning without either McGowan's, for the second half of that game effectively was something I would have thought there's no way, just not possible.
Yeah, I saw.
How did you? How were you screaming at your TV as much as I was about? I mean, and I've never been so passionate about Nebraska basketball as I would say yesterday was peak passion for me watching that game, because it literally felt like the refs were doing this on purpose. I mean, they were in the double bonus by the 16-minute mark in the second half, right? I mean, that's unheard of. I don't care what level you're playing, right? Like, I don't care if it's peewees all the way up to the pros. You do not see teams getting into, I mean, you don't see teams getting into that at any level that quickly. And all of a sudden it felt like it. I mean, they teed up Verge for falling down on the floor and looking at a ref as he was running by. He didn't say anything. He didn't hand motion. He didn't do anything. All he did was yell at himself on the floor, get up, turn and look at the ref and run down the floor. And they teed him up for that. Right. Like, I mean, have you ever seen anything like that before? I mean, I don't think they're going to fine us for talking about this here. And, if they are, feel free to say so. And I apologize to the NCAA and the Big Ten, but
I think we're safe. I haven't seen a technical like that before. And, anytime you get into the bonus that early, it's a pretty good sign that this has been a curiously officiated game, I guess would be the kind way to put it. I just kind of shook my head most of the game yesterday. For better or for worse, through having done this for a while now, I tend to watch these games with kind of like an accountant's energy, particularly football, because I'm like charting every play. So I keep a pretty even keel, but yesterday had its moments where it shook my steadiness, I guess, because there were some there. Yeah, there were some there where you're just like, what is happening?
Well,
you go ahead.
Well, the Reddit college football account, they said Nebraska, dead last in the Big Ten, overcomes a wild game rigged against them to pull off a close upset over number one conference Wisconsin. Wins of fortune changing for the Huskers? ? It's not a bad way of looking at it.
It was and I talked about this a little bit yesterday on our post game recap, our
rapid
reaction. Thank you, Honky. I'm getting up there in age, and I mentioned it too. Like when I was a kid, while Nebraska football was something that was always in my household from family, because my grandfather's from Nebraska. Growing up in California, I didn't really have any local teams basketball to root for. Cal and Stanford hadn't yet reached their peak, coaching time and all that. And so I'm watching the 86 tournament with Steve Kerr and, the Arizona Wildcats and Lute Olson coaching. So I've been an Arizona fan, for so long. And I felt that kind of passion for the Husker basketball team yesterday, like watching them play and like thinking like, oh my God, the whole world is just out to get these guys and they're playing their hearts out. And it's been, I'd have to say, I watched every game this season, and that was probably for me, like the turning point to where I probably won't miss another game again for the foreseeable future. I mean, and I'll be looking forward to Husker basketball without any self-paved optimism that being part of the show brings, right? Like this is like something where now I'm going to be like following the recruiting, everything, because it really seems like, again, the confidence that they put into Hoiberg then turn like the rest of these guys like, okay, this is going to be our coach next year. Like we better start doing something or we're not going to be playing. They're going to replace us. Right. And it really felt like that. I don't know if you got that feeling, but that's kind of the way it's been the last 3 games, right? Where it's like, all of a sudden these guys realize, okay, this guy's going to be here next year. So if we want to come back, we better put in a little bit more extra effort, because otherwise we won't be back.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I had some concerns. It didn't look like Nebraska when they had their really rough stretch and won one Big Ten game. Like in my view, it wasn't a team that defended hard all the time. And that really bugged me. There was a lot of kind of individual play. Like you could see, Hoiberg's a big, like, stats optimized basketball guy, so you know that they know where they want to get their shots. They know how they want to do it. They know the pace that they want to play with. And that's all backed by their basically philosophy to that. And it just was a team that couldn't consistently execute it. And then it was like a switch flipped, and who knows why. I think it made me stop and say, well, the only kind of new thing here was a known fate for the head coach. So what does that mean for the team as a whole? And it indicates to me that maybe there were gains happening for Nebraska that were hard to see, like even much harder than football. We're not talking, one score losses every time out. Basketball seemed to be like 30 minutes of pretty good basketball, and then inevitably, a bigger, stronger Big Ten team would just kind of slowly distance themselves. So it's made me much more curious about the future for Nebraska basketball. See if they actually have something here, or if it's just kind of a 4 or 5 game blip.
I wish we had one of those graph comparisons that Boomer likes to tweet out about, like where it shows like the scoring graph, and it goes up, and then you can see like Nebraska kind of fading off like this.
Off, yeah.
But like lately, it's been like this, like Nebraska's on top, and maybe they come together, but then Nebraska just ends right back up to the top. And I know everyone at home can see my hand motions, especially when we make this a podcast.
I think that's part of that is it's the stability, and we've talked about that earlier with football and the football program. Stability can matter, and I think that certainly has played some role there. And I agree too. I think the defense and just the toughness. There are times against Ohio State where, we had that game controlled from the start to the end, and we'd be up double digits. And then Ohio State would go on that 5-point run. And you get this, there's a little bit in the pit of the stomach, like, okay, well, this is going to be where they get that run to get the lead, but it never happens. Verge or somebody would step up, make the big play. And it's like, oh, it's back up to 8. And it was that toughness, and you need toughness. And if you're going to be at the Kohl Center and you've got their fan base shouting things I have to mute the TV because of, and you're in a tough spot, you need that toughness from the team. And the team, I'm bought in. This is a team. When you think of apathy, I literally stopped watching them. I stopped paying attention when they were playing. And I never, if you asked me 8 days ago, I never would have thought I'd be talking about this team the way I am right now, but I'm totally bought in. Like I'm bummed that if we don't win the next 5 games, I'm bummed that the season could end, because all of a sudden these guys, it was fun to watch them, and they've given so much here in these 3 games. So it's really enjoy the moment. I'm just going to try to enjoy every one of these games that they get to play in this week.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hoiberg said something along the lines last night after the game of, he's like, man, I wish we could just start over. And I think that's, a pretty good way of putting it, because you've seen over these last 3, like, Verge can be a pretty good player, and Bryce McGowan has been a pretty good player, but seeing what Trey adds to that team, CJ Wilcher has been great. Yeah. And, a do-over would be good, but that's going to be in the cards. So now it's just keep winning until you don't, because that'll be the end of the season.
Yeah, and that was like the biggest part about Verge for me yesterday before the game, when McGowan's was announced to be out because of his hand. I actually tweeted out kind of like as a positive, like a gif of Verge, just kind of shaking his head saying, let's go, right? And he's the same player that he was the entire season yesterday, but it felt like the difference is that he was himself on a team level, as opposed to before, and when he got sat, right, like during the season, they never really said the details on any of that. It felt like he was himself for himself a little bit when you watch him play, right? And the last like 2 or 3 games, even when he's not McGowan's, even when he's, when he took control of the game. All right. He had a third of the points for the entire team, or more than a third of the points for the entire team. But not only that, he was like the heart and soul of that team. And even when he had to sit for that 8-minute stretch in that game, you could see him on the bench. I kept looking over on my TV, looking at the bench, trying to see what he was up. He was clapping. He was like, let's go. And I mean, it was a different player, even though it was the same guy with the same game, the last 3 games from him than you've seen previous in the season. And again, it's it really does. The whole culture thing. We keep coming back to that, but it really did feel like that. And it was so obvious just from that one thing. That's where I'm like, oh my God, this team really could. Like, if I was any other team in this tournament right now, I would not want to face Nebraska.
No one wants to play them right now. I've seen some Iowa fans on Twitter even posting that. Like, we would prefer not to play Nebraska right now. And look, we're on a roll, but hopefully that roll can keep going.
Yeah, and Northwestern has pretty much embarrassed us the last 2 times that we've seen them. So, I mean, what the hardest thing to do in sports is? Beat the same team 3 times in a row, right? Isn't that, while they may say, okay, in football, that's it. But in a season like basketball or baseball or where you're seeing a team multiple times in a season, that's the hardest thing to do is to beat.
Hey, I've been saying in football, it's going to be really hard for Iowa to beat us 8 straight times. There's so many of these streaks. It's going to be so hard to do the next.
Well, we're going 15-0 this year, so we're going to be breaking a lot of streaks.
Well, Brandon, at the start of this, I didn't know if we'd be doing a segment that I was going to add into our weekly show, or if this would be its own standalone show. This is at 50 minutes. We've taken plenty of your time, and this is definitely its own standalone show. And for everyone that's been watching along live, thank you very much. But Brandon, we always give our guests the parting shot at the end, and I just want to give you a chance to give us your final thoughts here. But Redcasters, go out there, go to hailvarsity.com/subscribe, use Redcast at the checkout. It's a great magazine, great web, everything, great coverage, and we use it for a lot of our stuff. So, Brandon, floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I've been following what you guys do for a while now, and it's really impressive the way you guys have been able to build a community. That's my view from somebody on the outside. Just like seeing a bunch of people that I have followed over the years for a bunch of different reasons, kind of like they often unite around you guys, and I can trace these things back to you guys. So kudos for me to you on that. It's super cool. And I do it for Hail Varsity. I appreciate what you guys said about the magazine. We've been doing this since 2012. I don't take that for granted. The media landscape is tough. It is. It's what it is. And then on top of that, our kind of unique selling proposition is a print product. But I think it's a great print product. I and all of our staff do our best. We're super passionate about that piece of it. So I understand the kind of potential audience of people who just subscribe to magazines or will subscribe to magazines. It isn't a growth area necessarily, but we're very fortunate, and we have a passionate group of potential readers in Nebraska fans. So if you haven't subscribed, or you've subscribed in the past and it just kind of fell off, I would just urge people to give us a shot. Check it out. You guys gave promo code earlier. You can do so at a discount. It means a lot to a locally owned Nebraska independent magazine. Subscribers are kind of everything for us. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a salesmanship and more of a.
Hey, I work for a newspaper, Brandon. I work for a newspaper, and we print a couple of magazines ourselves, right? I feel you, man. And I have to tell you that it's amazing when you get out there, how many people, when they're reading your product, and they're actually looking at, especially local news, which Hail Varsity is local news. It's just your local sports college team news. That's what it is. And I mean, I was super impressed. I literally, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, I got my first copy of it just like a month ago. And I was so impressed with it. I was just like, wow, this is awesome. I can totally get behind this. It was such a difference once you're holding it in your hand and you're looking at the articles and reading through them. So you guys are doing a great job over there, and it's educational, it's relevant, and I love it.
Yeah, the quality, that honestly, the quality of the print, the quality of the paper, the quality of the photos. I took a sports media class a couple years ago on campus, and Aaron Babcock was one of the guys that came in and spoke during it, and he talked about how he got started and how he started up Hail Varsity and how important that was, and passionate the quality and the visual element it is, and it just totally changes the game when you can see it like that. So Redcasters, I mean, we're not just talking out of our rear. I mean, this is legit, and go out there and get yourselves the Hail Varsity. But Brandon, again, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have you on more here. We'd love to, we'd like to partner with Hail Varsity as much as we can with the Hurrdat stuff, and we'd love to talk with Greg Smith on recruiting, talk with Aaron Sorensen. I did a Husker 101 a couple years ago with Mike Babcock. That was a blast, and just a great cast of characters over there. A lot of talent over at Hail Varsity. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
I appreciate it,
and
guys.
stick around for a second after we end the broadcast here, because we'd love to just give our thanks and stuff. So
Yeah.
appreciate
Sure.
So, anyways, Redcasters, thank you so much for listening. And until the next time, that's another Go Big Redcast.
it. Go Big Red.
GBR.